This is Basic, the Atari 8-bit podcast.
I'm Kevin Savitz, and this is an interview episode of Antic, the Atari 8-bit podcast. It's July 17th, 2015, and I am at KansasFest, which is a show for the Apple II. And the keynote speaker is Rebecca Heineman, and she is responsible for lots of Apple-y goodness, including Bard's Tale 3 and Dragon Wars and Task Times in Tone Town and Borrowed Time and Mindshadow and Out of This World for the SNES and dozens of Macintosh and Apple IIgs conversions and Crystal Quest on the Mac, which I love. And when she gave her keynote, which you should listen to, there will be a link in the show notes so you can watch her KansasFest keynote, she gave all sorts of wonderful Apple-y stories, but there was hints of Atari knowledge and goodness in there. So I have invited her into this weird little chapel at Rockhurst University where it's quiet to do an interview and talk about Atari things. Hello, Rebecca.
Hello there, Kevin.
So you started to tell a story about how you wanted an Atari 800 and you almost won one in a contest, but then you didn't. Can we have a summary of that tale?
Well, going back is that at the time, it was early 1980, I just bought an Apple II, pretty much every penny I had, and the only reason I was able to afford it was that somebody had bought it, had buyer's remorse, and wanted to sell it for like half price. So had that not happened, I would never have been able to afford an Apple. In this case, it was just an Apple II. I had to get the other things to make it to a plus and more memory later. Well, I also had an Atari 2600. And I was using my Apple II to help me copy the cartridges so that I could save money, but I saw all the blurbs and all the ads from Atari about this new line of computers they came out with, which was the 400 and the 800. I didn't want the 400 because the chiclet keyboards was like, what? But the 800 is like, oh my god, 2 cartridge slots, basic, all the color graphics and stuff I read about. It's like, I want one. I so want one. And a contest came up in which the prize for the Nationals was an Atari 800 fully loaded. I mean, you got 2 floppy disks, you got a printer, the computer, a bunch of Atari game cartridges to go with it. I mean, I'd be set if I got that thing. But of course, at the time, I didn't even think I had a snowball's chance in hell to win. But entered the Atari National Space Invaders tournament for the Atari 2600 in July 1980, and I won the Los Angeles Regionals. And then a few months later, I ended up in New York City, and I was then competing. And to note, the Atari 800 was second place. The first place prize was an Asteroid stand-up arcade video game, which was worth like $3,000, where the Atari 800 fully loaded system was somewhere retail around $1,500. So, but I was already thinking like, oh, if I could just get that Atari. And when we finally tabulated the score, or after we played the game, the judges were tabulating the scores and they were announcing the winners. And as they were calling out names that were not mine, I was like, oh my goodness, there's only 2 names left. I'm going to get an Atari. And then when they were calling out the second place winner and they announced the player from New York, my reaction was, damn! Oh no! And then that's when it dawned on me, does this mean I actually won the whole thing? And so endeth my adventure there with the Atari 2600 Nationals, in which I won, and I got my 15 minutes of fame, but I didn't get an Atari 800.
Sorry.
But I eventually got one. I mean, about a year later, I was able to finally scrape together enough money to buy it, and I used it. The first thing I did was, because at the time I knew the Apple II, and I used a disassembler and so forth, I ported the code for the Apple II disassembler from an Apple II, and I hand wrote all the hex bytes into an Atari, created a bin file using a hex editor, then I loaded it, and it ran, and I was able to disassemble code using the exact same commands as an Apple II.
Wow.
With that, I then started learning how to play around with the registers, the pokey, the antic. Many times I watched my computer crash because I would write something and now the screen's unlegible and I have no way of restoring it. So that was, hit reset, loaded the thing back off disk because I had an 810 floppy. I think it was called 810.
Mm-hmm. Probably.
But loaded it up and then just made some demos and stuff like that on the Atari to learn how to program the system. And this came in handy because a year later, after we founded Interplay, a contract came in which Electronic Arts wanted us to convert Racing Destruction Set from the Commodore 64 to the Atari 800. I was the only person at the company who had Atari experience of any kind. So I then, using an Apple II to write all the code, and I made a cross-assembler, because I was really comfortable using an Apple II to write 6502 code. But I then hooked it up to I hooked up an 810 drive to my Apple II, used it to create 810 disks, then I would take the floppy, put it into an Atari, and then B-run it, or what was the command?
Binary run?
Yeah, binary run. And it would load in the game, and I would test it and sample it and run it that way. It was a little tedious, but I got the job done. Mm-hmm. Later on, I did a game called Mindshadow, and I ported it from the Apple II. Actually, I started with the C64 version and ported that to the Atari 800. Actually, it worked on both the 400 and the 800. And that one was tricky because it used a mode on the Apple II and the C64 where I had 4 lines of text, and then the rest of the screen was graphics. Mm-hmm. But if you hit return, it made the whole screen just text. Because this is something you can easily do in the Apple II. It's actually supported in hardware. I wrote a custom command list. I think it was the TIA. There was a command list you could do with it.
The display list?
Yeah, the display list. Mm-hmm. I created 2 display lists, one for the text-only mode and the other one for the graphics and text, and I just switched between the two depending on which mode it was.
Nice.
And I even emulated the Apple II memory map using it to help facilitate the port.
Just to make the port as easy as
make the port as easy as possible. Oh. But I still remember now how when I was loading up Mindshadow, I heard the beep, 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 beep when the Atari disk drive was reading sectors. Mm-hmm. And I also remember the fact that Atari sectors are 128 bytes was the only machine that had that. And I was like, okay, I had to compensate for that, but...
Was that more or less than
small? It was the smallest sector size I've ever worked with. Every other floppy disk of the time was either 256 bytes. That was the Commodore and the Apple. Mm-hmm. The PC was using 512. But, the Atari used 128, and I think it's part of the reasons why the disks had so little data on them. I think, wasn't the floppies like 90K? Mm-hmm. Which I thought was a little, darn. It made things challenging to get the game running on a floppy disk on the Atari because of the small size of the disks.
Was there any talk of doing it on a cartridge or just for ease?
Oh, no. It was, at the time the game was being done, it was like 1984, 85. Floppies started becoming more normal, and it was far cheaper to duplicate a floppy than it was to make a cartridge.
So Racing Destruction Set, tell me a little about that. You mentioned something last night about the pixel width, the 8-bit car looks dumb. So
yeah. Well, what happened was that when I was doing the port from the C64 to the Atari 800, the C64 version of the game used text-based graphics and it went font, which is something the Atari supports. So that went across 1-to-1. I mean, I lost no fidelity whatsoever. But the hang-up was that the Commodore 64 uses very large sprites compared to what we had in the Atari 800. One of the problems also is that the Commodore had 3 color sprites. There's a 4th color, but that's invisible. Mm-hmm. So you have 3 colors, an invisible color, so the cars had detail to them. Well, my problem was that on the Atari, the sprites only had 1 color. It was just 8 bits wide, just 1 color. Right. So I ended up, in order to get the cars to look good, I had 2 sprites. One was color A, the other sprite was color B, overlaid them on top, and then, because the cars were originally drawn about 12 pixels wide, I would have to cut off 4 pixels. That's about 50% of the car's width, 33% of the car's width, I had to hack off, made the cars look stupid. And so I came up with a hack in which I used what they call the missiles on the Atari, which are just 1-bit sprites.
Right.
And I used that,
Two.
and there was 2 of them, and I put those one on each side of the car. And that is where I got the details for like the edges of the car. So when the car's turning and the bumpers are sticking out, I would have the pixels there on the left or the right. But it gave the illusion that these cars were 10 pixels wide. And it allowed me to render these cars as sprites so I can retain most of the C64 code as is. But it was able to get the visual fidelity I needed.
Nice. How important was it to reuse code? I mean, was that just like the ultimate goal was to importing? Because in some games, not yours, you can tell they reused all the code, and wow, this looks like crap on the Atari. It looks like an Apple game. I mean, so how much trade-off was there?
Well, the trade-off is that the game logic should just run, because it makes no assumptions on what it's running on. It could be running on an Apple II, C64, Atari 100. Code that like reads the joystick or something like that, or actually processes the joystick inputs, not reads the actual joystick, but okay, you press left, what do I do? Oh, you turn the tires, or you do this, whatever. That doesn't change. But what does change is like, this is what gave birth to the idea of me doing BurgerLib, which is a set of libraries where I say, call a function to read the joystick. Well, I substitute the Atari version, the Commodore version, the Apple II version to read the joystick. But the data it returns is the same data. So that therefore, if I read a Commodore joystick, I read this bit pattern and I give it back. If it's the Atari, I take that and move it around so it returns the exact same pattern. The Apple II, I read the analog joystick, turn it into bits like an Atari, return that. So the main code, all it knows is, oh, you took your joystick, press left. How it pressed left or what type of joystick you had, I didn't care. And this is what allowed me to take as much of the code as possible from the host game and have confidence that all I have to do is assemble it, put it on the Atari, and that code's going to run. The only thing I need to make sure works is the display code, the custom code that actually talks to the Atari hardware.
Nice. During my talk yesterday, you said something about how many you sold, and
one of the biggest problems is why Mindshadow, as well as Race and Destruction Set, were like one of the few games on the Atari. The biggest problem is that while everybody was asking for and demanding Atari games, no one was buying them. And the problem was that because the 810...
We didn't want to buy them, we just wanted to play them.
Yeah, you want to play them. And the problem is the only way we actually found copy protection work was cartridges. Because, when you manufacture a cartridge, the casual user can't copy a cartridge. I mean, yes, there were some hackers that figured out ways of duplicating ROMs, but those are like so... Not enough of them were doing that make it consequential. But the 810 floppy drive was almost impossible to copy protect. And as a result, it was nearly child's play to take any game, put it in this disk drive, make a copy of it, and now you have a copy of Race Instruction Set. I don't know whether or not that was the sole reason. I've also heard even back then that the numbers of Atari consoles that were being sold was grossly inflated. Like we would ask Atari how many they sold, and they would say, oh yeah, we sold a couple million. But then we would look at the stores, and the stores would say, yeah, we sold like a couple, but these Commodore 64s are flying off the shelves. And of course our software sales reflected it. And the Atari version of Race and Destruction Set, we sold maybe 3,000 copies. Mule didn't fare much better. It sold maybe 4,000 or 5,000 copies at most. Whereas on the Commodore, it sold easily 10 times this number. I'm talking about a Race and Destruction Set. Yeah. So on the Commodore, they just who was it? Was it Freefall? I forgot who was the actual group. Paul Rishi, I think it was. But the group that did Race and Destruction Set made most of their royalties from the C64 version. We sold enough copies of the Atari version to just pay for the port.
Wow.
But there was no profits at all for the original developers. There was no royalties for me or Interplay. So as a result, the enthusiasm for doing more ports, like after we did Mindshadow for the Atari, we sold a few thousand, and that was it. Whereas, again, Apple II, we sold something like about 50,000 copies. So it made it so that putting all of the money and effort and energy into developing a game, it really didn't pay. Let's do some math here. We sold the game for like about $39.95 back then, which means is that the developer might get $15. But if you only sell 3,000 copies, that's $45,000. Sounds like a lot of money, but really it costs about $200,000 to $300,000 to create a game. You just lost serious money on that. So then why would someone want to make more games on your platform? Now, I know we didn't charge that much money to do a port. I believe we charged like $20,000, $20,000, somewhere in that range to convert the C64 to the Atari. So, somewhere in that number. I mean, don't quote me on that because I don't really know the exact amount, but I know it wasn't that much money. But, when let's say EA paid $20,000 to us to do the conversion, of course I got my money from just being an employee and shareholder of Interplay, which wasn't that much, and then only getting a few thousand copies being sold, then EA was like, well, our future games, we're just not going to bother porting to the Atari.
I knew Racing Destruction Set. I didn't really remember Mindshadow, and I looked it up on Atari Mania. Like, I remember why now, because the cover freaked me out. There's the face on it, and it's like this ghostly face, and there's the hand, and that's sort of being
face.
I look at there's something about a hand being like trapped inside a.
Yeah, that's actually inside the box. And so
inside. So that's why I saw that. I saw that now, as I'm like, oh, that looks freaky. That's scary. I'm not playing that.
Yeah. Well, actually, the game Mindshadow is inspired by the Bourne Identity.
Really?
The game starts off as that you wash up on a beach with no idea of who you are, how you got there, or anything. And because it's a graphic text adventure, you just enter commands and so forth. It's kind of like an Infocom game with graphics. Mm-hmm. But as you solve puzzles and stuff, you finally get off the deserted island, you start remembering things, and then you start realizing that somebody tried to kill you. And then you realize why that person tried to kill you, and then you realize that person's figuring out that you're alive and is coming to get you. Mm. All the while during the game, you were slowly recovering your memories. And, of course, at the end of the game, you realize who you were, and then confront the person who tried to kill you. But that's the whole basis of the game, is that you are someone who has complete amnesia, hence Mindshadow. And, again, but it's, back to just the stuff about Atari is that, there were several things that really went against it. One, there was no real good way to copy protect the games. B, piracy was rampant because of the fact there was no way to copy protect it. And number 3, a cost issue, because we either had to distribute our games on cartridge, which was prohibitively expensive when you're comparing it to the cheapness of putting discs out in the Apple II and the Commodore 64. But another problem was that because the Atari drives were so small, it was like 90K.
I think it was 88K.
Yeah, 88K. Yeah. The problem is that it meant that we would have to pack in 3 or 4 more discs if it was a larger game.
So it was cheaper on disc, but then 4 times, cheaper but not.
Yeah, because it's cheaper but not. Because one of the problems with floppies is that they sometimes go bad, so that therefore we would put a game with, let's say, if it's just 1 disc, well, there's only 1 disc that can go bad. So the sales are pretty good, returns are limited. But if you have to put 4 discs in the package, now you have 4 chances to go bad, because it only takes 1 disc to go bad when someone has to send the package back. And, that's when and also, a lot of these games were that we would, use lots and lots of data, and we, it really hurt the experience where you had to keep swapping floppies back and forth. Because remember, Mindshadow shipped on 2 floppy disks, whereas the original Apple II version, you flipped on 1. Those are all the little problems we were having. And it all compounded to it, like high cost of goods, medium cost of developing the title, because it was really not much different than cost of developing on the Commodore, but the the lack of return on investment.
Do you think the rate of piracy on the Atari side was higher or the same as Commodore and Apple?
I think it was higher. I think it was very high, mostly because it was so easy for anybody to pirate it. On the Commodore 64, there were copy protections and so forth, which made it difficult to copy something. There were some games there that it would thwart the pirates for a while, and when it finally was released, a broken version, you had to go to the BBSs, the bulletin boards. The trouble is that for the casual user, which is the people we really care about, the mom and dads, the kids, and so who don't really have access to BBSs because they're not interested in BBSs. They try to take the disc and say, hey, can I get a copy? Sure. Oh, it doesn't copy. Oh, well, and stops right there. Yeah. Whereas the Atari, the odds are pretty darn good that they would be able just to copy the disc without any trouble. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, they would just give it to their friend, not even thinking that it was hurting the developer.
Right. Any other Atari stories?
Atari stories. Let's see here. I do remember the fact that, playing with the Atari and then later on seeing the Atari 65XE and the 130XEs and playing with them, but at the time then it's like, it's a little too late.
Yes. Yeah.
I remember the resurgence of the Atari in the form of the Atari ST, and it was a serious contender to the Amiga. And I was actually looking into doing programming on that. I was working on some stuff for Bard's Tale for the Atari ST. Task Times in Tone Town for the ST. But even it was that they had this wacky development system, and they was using that TOS, Tramiel OS, which was a very crude implementation, because at the time I was using the Apple IIgs, which was based on Mac OS. So it's all slick and professional, looks pretty, and then you look at the Amiga, while it's hardware accelerated, it has some cute features, even the graphics of the desktop really bite. The Tramiel operating system, while it looked prettier than the Amiga, it was still kind of clunky and just wasn't friendly to use, and it crashed all the time, at least in the model machine I had. And I remember there was a time in which they told me for my Atari ST that, if your ST is broken, what you got to do is pick it up and drop it. And it would push the chips back in, and then the Atari ST would work again. And I'm like, okay, and this is...
That's funny. I think maybe it's like some sort of lore. The Atari people hear that story about the Apple III. It's just like, like that's, maybe it was a common thing.
No, it was a thing on the Atari ST, and I remember there was times which the ST I had to push the keyboards in it every now and then. I didn't actually drop the thing. I just simply pushed the keyboards down, and whatever chips were being loose in their sockets or whatever, they were wiggling out for us.
It was a common complaint about the way that Tramiel made computers is that they went as cheap as possible.
Yep.
So things went wrong because they didn't care.
Yep. And then later on, Atari shot themselves in the foot again because they released the Jaguar, the video game console. Yep. But the fact that they required you to use an Atari ST Falcon to do all your development on. Oh. They refused to convert their development tools to run on a PC or any other machine, like a Mac or a PC. Mostly people were asking for a PC. And developers were saying, why do you want me to develop on your console using the Atari ST, using this really crappy operating system that's buggy as all hell, that you have to keep pushing in the keyboards, and peripherals like hard drives were very hard to come by. So it really turned off a lot of potential developers. I know that the companies I was working with really did not like using the Atari ST as a development system. And so I have no idea why Atari itself made these decisions, but they really were, I don't know, maybe they were hell-bent on destroying their own company.
Seems that way. Yeah. Great. Do you want to talk about your current project?
Well, currently my project at this moment is I'm working on a updated version of Bard's Tale. I wrote the original trilogy on the 2GS, Bard's Tale 1, which is Tales of the Unknown, Bard's Tale 2, Bard's Tale 2, Destiny Night, and Bard's Tale 3, The Thief of Fate. The 2GS version was never shipped, but I did work on it, and I did create it. But I was the one who wrote the Apple II C64 versions of the Bard's Tale 3. In fact, I wrote pretty much every version of it, because I created the damn game. But I got to a contract with In Exile, who's currently got the rights to do Bard's Tale 4. And they did a successful Kickstarter. And there were a lot of people who wanted me on the project. So they said, hey, we want to play the trilogy. So one thing led to another. And now I have gotten a contract with In Exile, in which I'm taking my original trilogy, converting them over to run on Windows Native. So you get the native, all the 2GS graphics, all the 2GS sound. It's not emulated. I'm actually recompiling the code to getting it, and then changing the GS-specific code to Windows code and Mac code for the Mac version. And hopefully in about a month or two I should have that out.
Nice.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. Let's see. You talked earlier about yesterday about you did some cracking on the Apple side of things. Did you ever experiment in that area with the Atari side of things?
That's why I know that was so easy, because there's nothing for me to crack. I mean, it was like on the Apple II, it was really a challenge to crack stuff on the Apple II in some cases. Most of them were like, no challenge, I would be cracked in 10 seconds. Mm-hmm. I think the fastest crack I did was actually about 3 minutes. Mm-hmm. But some of them took me a couple of days, but they never took me more than 3 days. Never. The Atari 100 was one where, like, okay, I take the disk, put it in there, use the Atari copy program, copy it onto another disk, runs fine. Well, my job is done. Not that I did anything, but my job was done.
Right.
So I kind of actually didn't have any interest in hacking, because there was nothing for me to do. And as I understand, there were disks that had copy protection, but there were other hackers that did that, like I think it was like a laser hole one where you actually burn a hole in one of the sectors. Mm-hmm. So the 810, if you try to write that sector, would always fail, and then they would test for that.
Right. So I heard a story about that. I don't know, saying there was a company that did that as a turnkey solution. They would put lasers use a laser to make a hole in the disk. They actually used drill bits. It was just a drill.
If it was a drill,
they claimed one thing, didn't know. I don't know. It works, sort of.
Well, the problem is a lot of the places that were doing these copy protections were kind of fibbing, mostly just so they could go ahead and sell their wares to people.
Yeah.
I myself to this day get people contacting me saying, "Hey, we got this DRM solution. You can install it in your game, and no one will be able to crack it." And the few times they've actually come to my office to check it out, I said, great, show me this, it's been locked. Okay, great. And I then put it in my machine, pull up a debugger, within 20 minutes, tops, here's a copy of the game. And it says, if I could do this, and there's some hacker in Russia or from China or something like that who's going to do this because they have nothing else better to do, and it will end up on a BitTorrent site, which is, in modern days, it's trivial for you to distribute something.
Yeah.
So, therefore, it's like, what's the point? Just make sure we give people the honor system. Just say, like Good Old Games does, just say, if you like my game, buy it. I mean, in fact, if anyways me locking up the game is just really just giving an invitation to some hacker just to hack it just for the sake of, telling me to go away or, screw you.
Right. Having some cred. All right, last question. If you could send a message to the Atari computer users that still exist, and you can right now, what would you tell them?
Make stuff. Make new demos. Make new stuff. I mean, the Atari was a really underrated computer. To be honest, had the Atari 100 was released around the time, a little bit later than the Apple II, but had the Atari 800's chipset been designed around a bus like an Apple II, so you had expandability, and then add something like ProDOS, make it like a business computer, but still kept the graphics and sound, well, we would be all sitting here at KansasFest celebrating the Atari GS while Atari's coming out with the new Falcon 7 or whatever it is, Intel machine making billions of dollars.
Right.
Because of the machines out there, the Atari hardware was the funnest and best I had to work with. It really broke my heart to find out that despite the ease of use of the hardware of the Atari, the colors, remember of the three, the Atari, the C64, and the Apple II, the Atari had the best colors, the best graphics, the best, most powerful ability with the display list to do stuff. but the cheapness of the hardware, the operating system that was a joke, they took what was the best hardware, applied the worst software, and threw the market away. Make a better operating system. Make something really, really cool. Especially make an affordable hard drive. I think there's probably one already out there. But other than that, it's a really wonderful little toy, and I love playing with it.
Thank you very much, Rebecca.
Well, thank you very much for having me on your show.
If you enjoy these interviews and would like to contribute something, I encourage you instead to donate to one of our favorite organizations, the Internet Archive, at archive.org. The Internet Archive is a nonprofit digital library with the stated mission of universal access to all knowledge. They've done incredible things to preserve computer history, including hosting thousands of programs in an in-browser Atari emulator, creating the Wayback Machine, and offering full-page scans of countless Atari computer books and magazines. Make your tax-deductible contribution at archive.org/donate.